Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf tet zayin. It's the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started from the previous daf at the very bottom. So what we saw in yesterday's daf at the end was that Rebbi Chia and Rebbi disagree about Rabbi Chia and Rebbi disagree about whether a shchita which is performed with an item attached to the ground is a valid shchita or not a valid shchita. Within Rebbi, who said it's not a valid shchita, Rabbi Chia said it was, we have a contradiction because he seems to say in one place that it would be accepted post facto, to which we distinguish between items attached to the ground and items that were detached that then become attached to the ground later. So they're attached to the ground, but only because they were placed in a place made attached to the ground, but not that they grew like that. Then we had a question about how do we know that we can make this distinction, to which we answered based on this braita. And this braita we're going to deal with a lot today, so we're going to read through the braita again. It's at the bottom of Tef Vav Amud. If you slaughter with a mechanism, we're going to talk about what that is, then the shchita is valid, right? Which means you're not actually touching the knife, but using a mechanism like some sort of wheel to cause the knife to move and slaughter the animal. That's valid. If you use something attached to the ground, your slaughtering will be valid. If you stuck a knife in the wall and used that knife while it was stuck in the wall to slaughter the animal, it's also valid. However, if you had a flint or a stone coming out of the wall, or you had a reed growing from the ground, and you used it, shlitato psula. So now they say kashin hadad. Right? It said things are attached to the ground, the slaughtering is good, and then it said later the slaughtering is invalid with items attached to the ground. So how do we resolve this? Elalav shmaminan. This is why we brought it in the first place. Is it not that we can infer from here shani be mechubar miikaro letalushu levasof chibro shmamina? We can infer from here that we're going to differentiate between things that were attached to the ground from the beginning and things that were detached and then later got attached to the ground. Amar Mar. So now we're going to go into the details of this braita. Isn't there a different place where it talks about using a mechanism and it says the shchita is actually disqualified? It seems to contradict our braita. Lo kasha habasarna depachara. One is using a potter's wheel, the habasarna demaya, and the other is using a water wheel. Now, a water wheel works off the water, not by the person's actions. But the potter's wheel is the way the wheel spins is by a human interacting with it and causing it to spin. So when there's a person behind the action, we're going to say, oh, well, if you use that to get the potter wheel to spin, to get the knife to slaughter, that's fine. But if it's water, then that's not fine. Perhaps you could also answer that both are talking about the water wheel. The lokasha habakoch rishon habakoch sheni. One is the first spin and one is done by the second spin or subsequent spins. What's the difference? Well, how do you get the water wheel started? Again, you need human interaction to open up whatever's covering the water from getting there. And then you let the water in. As soon as it immediately hits there and starts spinning, if that causes the knife to slaughter, that will be considered a valid slaughter. But if it's already koch sheni, that's already indirect. Okay, so we have here, this goes back to sugyot, if you remember, from Baba Kama, that someone who puts a coal on someone's chest and then it burns through them, right? All sorts of potential. What's considered indirect damage? What's considered damage? Like when we throw something from the roof and it then falls on someone, or someone moves something and then it causes it to fall, right? Exactly in what situation are we going to cause you or hold you responsible for this? So that's what we're talking about here. If it's done by human action, then we're going to call that a valid shchita. If it's not, then it's not going to be a valid shchita. Now here we're going to prove this same issue that we're going to differentiate. And here we're getting into cases of actually causing someone's death between direct action and indirect action. Somebody bound his friend, tied him up so he couldn't move, then diverted a flow of water to go directly onto the person, and the person dies from it. Chayav. Obviously, the person's obligated because they did an action that directly caused. Now, it's a little indirect, but basically by making the water go onto that person, it caused the person to die, and that was their direct action caused it. Right? My taima, what's the reason? We're going to say this directly. Girei didehu dahanebe. It was that person's arrows that killed that person, meaning their direct action caused the death. But that's only when he diverted the flow and it went directly. But if he diverted the flow and then that caused, and then the flow maybe trickled somewhere and dropped somewhere else, or once there's already less direct action incurred here, then we're going to call that grama ba'alma. It's indirect. That was a big term we used in Nezikin. Grama, which is you're not usually obligated for grama, and you won't be obligated for killing them. So that just proved the distinction that we made in order to resolve the contradiction between that braita and the other braita. Yativ Rav achorei de Rabbi Chia. Now we're going to have a scene in the Beit Midrash. Rav is standing behind Rabbi Chia because he was his student. Rabbi Chia kamei de Rebbi. Rabbi Chia was behind Rebbi. This is like the order of prominence. Rebbi, then Rabbi Chia, then Rav. V'yativ Rebbi v'kam Rav. And Rebbi was sitting in the Beit Midrash and taught the following. He asked the following question and answered it. Minayin l'shchita shehi b'talush. How do I know this is exactly what he disagreed with Rabbi Chia about. How do I know my opinion that shchita has to be with something detached from the ground? Shene'amar v'yikach et ha'ma'achelet lishchot. It says by, a very interesting pasuk he chooses, by Abraham, when he goes to do Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, and it says he took the ma'achelet with him, he brought it with him, the knife, to slaughter Yitzchak. Okay, now, that means he took the knife. Why did he take the knife? Because he couldn't use anything that was attached to the ground, so he came prepared with his own knife. Amar le Rav, the Rabbi Chia, my kamar. So Rav says to Rabbi Chia, how exactly do we get it from this pasuk? Not so clear to me. First of all, it's not so clear that he brought the knife so that he would have something detached from the ground. And also, by the way, it wasn't like he was slaughtering an animal for eating purposes. He was slaughtering his son. It is a bit of a strange pasuk. To which Rabbi Chia responds with a very harsh response. Harsh against Rebbi. Amar le vav dichtiva ufta kamar. This is like a vav written on the trunk of a tree. If you try to write on the trunk of a tree, it's got all these ridges and stuff, your vav is going to come out with a lot of holes in it. You're not going to get a straight solid vav because it's not a smooth surface. Well, that's what his argument is like. It's like an argument full of holes. That pasuk is a totally not relevant pasuk. And obviously Rabbi Chia also doesn't agree with Rebbi about his halakha in any case. So he says this is not a pasuk that really proves anything. To which the Gemara turns around and questions this whole interaction and says, "V'ha kra kamar," but he actually had a pasuk. Why was Rabbi Chia so against it? Kra is rizute de Avram kamash malan. He says, no. The pasuk about Avram bringing the knife was just showing how zariz Avram was. What does it mean, zariz? He made sure to get everything. He was on top of everything. He made sure to bring his own knife just in case he didn't find anything to use. Forget about attached to the ground. He was worried he wouldn't find any implement to use, so he brought his own knife. That's why he wanted so much to make sure to do everything he can to fulfill God's word. So he brought a knife with him. But it has nothing to do with shchita, nothing to do with shchita for things attached to the ground, and moving on. Amar Rava. Rava now is going to apply this concept of talush ulevasov chibro, something that was detached and became attached, for other areas of halakha where we have a need for something to be detached from the ground. So first we're going to start with avodah zarah. Okay, the first thing you have to know, if you learned Masechet Avodah Zarah, you might remember this, that we learned that in order to be something to be an idol, and for you to be liable for worshiping that idol, it has to be something detached from the ground. If it's, for example, a mountain, and we'll see in a minute when we see the pasuk why I used a mountain as an example, and you bow down to the mountain as if it's some other god, that is not avodah zarah. Okay, we'll see in a minute where we get it from. So comes Rav and he says, Pshitali, it's obvious to me, and he's going to basically say, this is a halakha, we know what it is. With the next one, we're going to see it's a machloket, but that's also obvious. And then he's going to ask the question, what about by shchita? How do we view something that's detached and then becomes attached to the ground? And then we're going to have 3 attempts to answer that question. We're not going to succeed. So Amar Rava, Pshita li talush levasof chibro li'inyan avodah zarah have talush. When it comes to worshiping idols, that is considered detached from the ground. Da Amar Mar, as actually it should say Da Amar Rav, that's what the Bach changes it to. As Rav said, Hamishtachaveh labayit shelo asaro. If I bow down to my house, I actually forbade my house from anyone benefiting because I turn my house into an idol. Okay, now, first of all, why my house and not your house? Because I can't forbid something that's not mine. I can't just call your house an idol and forbid it to anyone to get benefit from your house because it's not mine. But I could do it to my own house. So if I bow down to my house, I forbid my house. It's not forbidden to benefit from. Now, if you say a house is attached to the ground, Elohehem al ha'arim v'lo ha'arim Elohehem. This is the famous pasuk where they darshan this halakha from, which is in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 12, where it says, Abed ta'abdun et kol mekamot asher avdu sham hagoyim. Go destroy all the places where the non-Jews were worshiping idols. Asher atem yorshim otam, where you're going to inherit. Et Elohehem al ha'arim haramim v'al hagvaot. They're gods that are found on the high mountains and the hills. Now, what's the drasha? They're gods on the mountains. Not that the mountains are gods. The gods are on the mountains. That means the gods are what they're worshiping, their idols, are detached from the ground. And we're talking about their idols, right? They're supposed to wipe out their idols. Sorry, I didn't say it right. Their idols are items that are sitting on the ground, right? Or found on the mountains, but they're not the mountains themselves. That's what it says here. Elohehem al heharim. They're idols that are on the mountains. V'lo ha'arim Elohehem, but not that the hills and the mountains are the gods. So from there we learn that a house can't become avodah zarah if we view it as attached to the ground. Now, what is a house? Let's think about it. A house wasn't attached to the ground from the first place. It was made from items that were detached that in the end become attached to the ground. That is not mechubar for idol worship purposes. So you actually is, in the end, we're going to be stringent. That we're going to forbid your house if you worshipped it because that's considered worship of idols. Because we view it as detached. Okay, that's topic number 1. Topic number 2 is a bit more complicated. It's talking about, you just need to know some background information. Linyan hechsher zra'im tannaitic. So we're going to see it's a machloket tanaim about what the halakha is in the case of items becoming susceptible to impurity. How does an item, a food, let's say, become susceptible to impurity? It has to have a liquid come upon it, one of the 7 liquids. Let's just call it water for right now. And in order for water what happens basically is first it has to be detached from the ground, then water has to get upon it. Now the water, it can't just be it got wet from something. It has to be it got wet intentionally, meaning someone had intention for the water to be there. If no one had intention for the water to be there, then it doesn't become susceptible to impurity. There has to be intent for the water to be there for it to become susceptible. So that's an important element to know. Now we're going to see a Mishnah in Machshirin, which is the Masechet that talks about things that are Machshir l'kabel tumah. That's why it's called Machshirin. It makes it susceptible to impurity. Ditna. Hakofeh ke'ara ala kotel b'shvil shetudach. I have a vessel, like a bowl, that I want to wash. So what do? I put it on top of a wall, upside down, and when the rain comes, the rain is going to wash it away. Now, while the rain is coming down, wash it off. While the rain is coming down, so I want the rain to come on my bowl. While it's coming on my bowl, what happens? The bowl is going to divert the flow of the water, and instead of falling on the wall, it's going to fall on fruits, or produce. We're going to call them perot, but it's really produce. So when it falls on my produce, it's true I didn't exactly want it to fall on the produce, but I did want it to fall on the bowl, and from the bowl it's going to go right onto the produce. So therefore, if I did it, bishvil shetudach, so that the bowl gets rinsed, hareze b'chiyutan. That's a case of I want the water to be there. So it's going to make them susceptible to impurity. However, if I put the bowl on top of the wall, bishvil shelo yilkeh hakotel, because I don't want the wall to have water damage, right? We do this in our house, and we divert water somewhere so it won't get into the walls. So I do it to divert the water, eino b'chiyutan, because there I don't want the water, right? I'm trying to get the water away from there, and I'm using the bowl as a diversion for the water to get it away. If it goes from there onto the fruits, that's not out of my will. I have to want the water to be there, not want the water not to be there. Okay? So far, this didn't have to do with our topic, if you're wondering. But ha-gufa kashya, there's actually a contradiction here. Now, not a direct contradiction, but if you make an inference from the Reisha and you make an inference from the Seifa, from the two lines here, you're actually going to come to opposite conclusions relating to the wall. We didn't really talk about the wall. We said the first case was to put the bowl on the wall in order to make sure the bowl got rinsed. The second one was to make sure the wall didn't get wet. Now, what it doesn't talk about is, what if you wanted your wall to get wet? What would the case be? So if you infer it from the beginning, it sounds like, well, that case, it'll be Ukshalik about Tumah, but not if you want it on the wall, only if you want it on the bowl, not on the wall. If you take the second case, it says only if you want to divert the water away from the wall, but if you want the water to be diverted to the wall, you could infer that it would actually be susceptible to impurity. So now we're going to say like this. So Hagufa Kashya. Amar b'shvil shetudach harei b'chiyutan. Now I'm just going to read what I just said. If you said it's in order to rinse the bowl, then you will make the fruit susceptible to impurity. But it sounds like if you wanted the wall to be rinsed, that won't be, because that's not the case they were talking about. They should have said if you put the bowl there to get the wall wet, you're going to make the fruits. If from there it drips to the fruits, you're going to make the fruit susceptible to impurity. But that's not what it said. It said specifically only for the bowl, not for the wall. Which makes it sound like for the wall it wouldn't be. Why wouldn't it be? Because now we get to our topic, because the wall is attached to the ground. Now remember, the wall was originally detached and only became attached. And after that it says, only if you're doing it to divert the water away from the wall will it not be susceptible to impurity, which would seem to infer, if you wanted to actually get the wall wet, it would be susceptible, would make the fruits or the produce susceptible to impurity. So how do we resolve this contradiction? And with this, we're going to see the machloket. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Tavra, Misha Shanazo, Lo Shanazo. Split this Mishnah into two and say the one who taught the first line is not the same person who taught the second line. It was two different sources that got put together. But one source, the first one, holds if you try to get the water on the wall, it's not going to be susceptible to impurity, because even though it was originally detached and now attached, but things that were originally detached but are now attached are going to be treated like they're attached to the ground. And therefore, getting that wet is not right. That won't create susceptibility to impurity on the produce. Whereas the second line, which seems to imply only if it's to divert the water away, but if you're trying to get the water away from the wall, if you're trying to get the water to the wall, it would create a situation where the produce that drips on them becomes susceptible to impurity, because you wanted the water on the wall, and the wall is something that was detached that now became attached. Well, we're going to treat it as something detached, and it can be relevant for susceptibility to impurity. So we see it treats it in two different ways. What do you see here? Machloket Tanaim. And that's what Rava's point was. So he said the first case of Avodah Zarah, it's definitely viewed as attached to the ground, but for the purpose of susceptibility to impurity, we're going to see it's a machloket between two Tanaim. Now, because we're on this topic, Rav Papa is going to explain the contradiction in the braita in the Mishnah in a different way. Okay, Amar Rav Papa Amar, Kul Achad Tanahu. He says, no, this is all one tannaitic opinion. And we're going to distinguish in a different way. There's two different kinds of walls. Ha bekotel ma'ara. One is the wall of a cave. The wall of a cave was always attached to the ground. Ha bekotel binyan. The second part is talking about a kotel that was built. The hachi kamar. And this is now, he has to really reread the Mishnah, because how do you get from one wall to a different wall? We were just talking about wall. It seemed like it was the same wall. So he reads it like this. Okay, starts out the same. You put the bowl upside down on the wall, and then it goes from there onto the produce. It will make the produce susceptible to impurity. Now, if you wanted to rinse the wall, what would you infer from here? That is not going to create susceptibility to impurity. Why not? Well, in what case are we referring to? Bekotel ma'aran, a wall that was attached to the ground. Aval bekotel binyan, but if it was a kotel that was built, bishvil shelo yokeh hakotel hu de'eno b'chiyutan. If you did it so the wall, you're trying to divert the water away, then it won't be susceptible to impurity. However, what can you infer from there? If you wanted to get the wall wet, and then from there it went to the produce, that would actually create susceptibility, because now we're talking about a wall that wasn't attached to the ground in the first place. And then according to everybody, according to Rav Papa, it does create susceptibility to impurity if it was not attached and became attached. Okay, now, so that related to the issue of, again, Rava, going back to Rava because we got off on a sidetrack of Rav Papa, Rava said the issue of avodah zarah definitely considered detached from the ground and therefore is considered an idol. Secondly, the second source shows it's a tannaitic debate if you go with Rabbi Elazar's interpretation. And now looking at Amabeh, we now have Rava's question. By Rava, talushu levasof chibro le'inyan shchita mai. What about relating to shchita? How would you view this case? As we already answered this, and that's why, where are they going to bring the answers from this? From the braita we saw in the previous daf that we started with today. Tashma, hayat sul yotzei min hakotel, if you had a flint coming out of the wall, o shayak kaneh ole me'elav, or you had a reed growing on its own, v'shachatbo, and you used it for slaughtering, shchitato psula, your slaughtering is disqualified. So what do you see here? You see that something that we're assuming now, right? Hacha b'mayas kinan bekotel ma'ara. So now they're going to say, so what they think here is that the tzur hayotzei min hakotel is talking about something that was detached and then became attached. And what do you see? The shchita is disqualified. To which the Gemara says, no. Hacha b'mayas kinan bekotel ma'ara. Maybe it's not talking about a case where it was detached and became attached in a wall of a house, or a wall that we built. Maybe it's actually talking about a wall that was originally there from the beginning, part of a cave. And in fact, Aikanami dekatane, and you can even further prove it, because what does it say there? Dumia dekane oleme elav, shma mina. It says there are two cases, one right next to the other. They're juxtaposed as if they're one. The flint jutting out of the wall. Now the wall, with the flint jutting out of it, we could say came from a cave because it's put right up next to a reed which is attached to the ground that grew like that, meaning it was always attached to the ground. So the two must be in the same category of things that from the beginning they were attached to the ground, in which case it teaches us nothing about what we're looking for. Tashma, second attempt from the same braita. Na'atz sakim bakota. We're actually going backwards in the braita. We started from the end, now we're going back. Na'atz sakim bakota v'shachat ba shchitato kshera. If you stuck a knife in the wall and you slaughtered it, the shchita is good. And what do you see here? That's also something that was detached and is now attached, and you can actually use it. So now we're going to say from here, it sounds like the opposite of what we tried to prove from the previous, that it actually would work. To which the Gemara says, no, shani sakin de lo mevatele. A knife that I stick in the wall is not really attached to the ground. It's attached to the wall, which is attached to the ground. But the knife itself is going to go in and out. We don't view this as if it's part of the wall just because it's attached to the ground. So we view that as something detached, and we're not going to learn anything from here for our topic. Tashma, but now we're going to go to this other line, which we already explained to be talking about exactly our case. In fact, I don't know if you were wondering, why did Rava ask this? We already saw. So let's read it again, and you'll remember if you didn't remember. That's how we started today. Things that are attached to the ground, the shchita is kshera. Then we said that disagrees with the last part of the Mishnah, with the reed and with the flint jutting out of the wall. And then we said, how do we resolve it? That line, mechubar lakarka, shchitato kshera, must be talking about if it was first detached, then became attached. And then what do you see here? It actually is valid. You can do a shchita with something like that. To which the Gemara says, and now they're going to reinterpret this braita differently than we interpreted at the beginning of class. Dilma perusha kamefarish. Maybe you read the braita as this line is coming to explain the next line, or the next line is coming to explain this line. See, like this. My mechubar lakarka. Okay, in other words, we say mechubar lakarka, the shchita is good when it's attached to the ground. But now we're going to use the next line to explain in what case we're referring to. Which is the case? What comes right after that in the braita? You remember? It says na'at sakim bakota v'shachat b'shchitato kshera. What immediately came after that was the thing with the knife. So what are they going to say now? That the my mechubar lakarka sakin de lo mevatele. When we say something attached to the ground you can use to slaughter, we mean something that's not really attached to the ground. Not because it was detached at first and then attached. No, that's not what it's talking about. It's the knife that we stuck into the wall, but we're going to eventually take it out, so it really is not part of the wall at all. That's the kind of mechubar that will say the shchita is kshera. but it doesn't tell us anything about the case that we're looking for. So in these 3 attempts to learn from this braita, in the end, we don't have any answer to Rava's question. And like I said, if we go by the way we started the daf today, and the interpretation there, that was how they resolved the contradiction between that and the last case, and said, oh, this must be the case exactly the one we're looking for. It was detached, it became attached. But the Gemara, I guess sort of for argument's sake, is saying, you can understand that differently, and you can understand that the knife case is really the only case that's going to be true for that sentence. And the next sentence kind of modifies that line. Okay, now, since we mentioned the knife case, we're now going to go back in depth into the knife case. So that was all the statement of Rava, where he talked about avodah zarah. He talked about the same issue when it comes to susceptibility and impurity, and then there he knew what it was. First one, definitely not attached to the ground. Second one, machloket tanaim, how this applies in susceptibility and impurity cases, and how it applies in shchita, he doesn't really know. He leaves it as an open question. Okay, so that's interesting also, by the way, that in certain areas we might treat something as attached to the ground. In other areas we might look at that same thing as different because the criteria for each of these halachot perhaps is different. Okay. Amar mar, na'at sakim bakotel v'shachat ba, shchitato kshera. So again, we go back to the knife case. You stuck a knife into the wall and you slaughter with it. It's valid. Now we're going to have Shmuel who's going to modify this statement. Amar Rav Anan Amar Shmuel, Lo shanu ela, shasakin lamala, v'tzavar behema lamata. This is only if the sakin is on top and the animal is below. And what are you going to do? Well, the knife isn't moving; it's stuck in the wall. You're going to take the animal and move it back and forth so that the knife makes this back and forth motion, which is the way you do a shchita. Aval sakin lamata v'tzavar behema lamala. But if you take the animal and put it on top of the knife and have it slaughter like that and move the animal's head back and forth, or the neck back and forth, what are we worried about? We're worried about gravity. Gravity is going to pull this animal down, and we're worried that you're going to end up chopping them rather than doing it in this back and forth motion. So you can't have the animal on top. Now the Gemara says, but what do you mean? Listen to this braita. The hakatani, doesn't it say in a braita, bein shasakin lemata, tzavar behema lamala, whether the knife is on the bottom and the animal's neck is on top, bein shasakin lamala v'tzavar behema lamata, or whether the knife is on the top and the animal's neck is on the bottom, either which way, it works. Okay? So Amar Rav Zvi litzdadin katane. So Rav Zvi says, don't worry about this contradiction, right? We had a lot of today contradictions between tannaitic sources or between 2 lines within the same tannaitic source. This is this tannaitic source with the previous one. So Rav Zvi says, no, this line, either way, either that way or this way, are actually each talking about a different scenario. So this braita we just brought to contradict is actually not talking about all one topic. He reads it like this: Sakin lamata v'tzavar behema lamala b'talush. So a sakin below and the animal's head on top works if the knife is detached. If the knife is detached, we assume you can control it enough to move it in the back and forth motion, even though gravity is pulling the animal down on top of the knife. However, sakin lemala v'tzavar lemata b'mechubar. But when the knife is attached to something that's attached to the ground, then the only way to do it is with the animal on the bottom, because otherwise we're worried if you put the animal on top, you'll have a problem of drisa, right, of it getting chopped off the head rather than back and forth motion. That's one way to resolve it. Rav Papa has a different way. Rav Papa Amar ba'ofa de kalil. He says maybe when that source says either head on top or head underneath, it doesn't matter. He's talking about a bird and not an animal. If it's an animal, the animal's very heavy. The bird is very light. If the bird is very light, let's go back to gravity. There's less, right? The less mass something has, the less gravity is pulling it down. So because of that, you'll be able to control it better even if the bird is on top and the knife is stuck in the wall. Okay? And therefore, he thinks that that's a different way to resolve this contradiction. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, v'amar la b'matnita tana. So either Rav Chisda says in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak or in a braita it says, Chamisha dvarim ne'emru b'klumit shel kaneh. There's 5 things said about a reed from, a stalk of a reed. Okay, now the issue here of these 5 things is going to be that a stalk of a reed can splinter off and make little splinters, which can cause all sorts of problems, either halachic or dangerous. Okay, we're going to see right now. Okay, ein shochatim ba, you can't slaughter with this stalk of a reed, which is a little bit strange because we actually saw that you can use the stalk of a reed to slaughter with, so we're going to have to resolve that contradiction. But first, let's just read the source. You can slaughter with it. What's the concern? That because it splinters off, it might splinter off and kill the animal before you actually finish performing the shechita. In malimba, you can't use it for circumcision because you might injure the child and perhaps affect their ability to have children later. Ve'ein mecha, right, the circumcision could cause a problem if, again, a splinter gets in or something like that. Or you cut it more with the, right, because it splinters off, you might actually cut it more. Ve'ein mechatchim babasal. You can't eat meat. Now, by the way, that is more of a danger issue. So are the upcoming ones. You can't slice meat with it because what will happen, just like there's bones in fish, which are very dangerous, if you get splinters in your meat, you'll eat the splinters and the little chips of wood, and it could be dangerous. You don't use it to clean your teeth out because it could get stuck and, cut your gums. You can't wipe yourself. This seems to be, we think it means when going to the bathroom, okay? Wiping your rectum with it could cause problems. Again, it'll pierce you. Ve'ein shochatim ba. So now we go back to the beginning. Okay, what do you mean ein shochatim ba? Va'atanya bakol shochatim. Bein betzor, bein b'schuchi, bein b'krumit shel kaneh. We saw that source already. You can slaughter with anything, whether it be flint, a shard of glass, or a stalk of a reed. So Amara Papa b'simona da'agma. When it said you could do it, that was by ones growing in a marsh, where they're softer, and soft ones don't splinter. It's when they're hard and dry that they splinter. When they're moist and soft, they're not going to splinter off. So if you're not worried about splintering, then it's fine. You don't cut meat with it. So now we're going to learn that Rav Papa mechatech ba kirbei dagim dezige. He used it for the innards of fish because they were transparent and you could see. So people wouldn't eat it if they could see there was a splinter in there. Rava bar Rav Huna mechatech ba ofa derakich. He would cut birds with it because the birds were soft, and because the birds were soft, it didn't create this tension. This is all like scientific stuff today. If you cut something hard, it's going to cause the reed to splinter off. If you cut something soft, it won't be such a big clash that it's going to cause it to splinter off. Okay, now we have a separate issue, which is a very interesting source. We'll see why in a minute. You can't wipe yourself with it because it's going to splinter off. But wait, why don't we just say you can't wipe with it for a different reason? Because a mekanech b'davar or sholetet bo, we have this other statement that if you use an item that's flammable, now a stalk of a reed is flammable. If you use something that's flammable, shinav noshrot. So if you wipe your rectum with something that's flammable, your teeth, now they don't mean your teeth in your mouth, they mean below, there's things they call your teeth that are in your rectum, are going to fall out, or it's going to cause something. We don't know really what this means. Now we use paper, which is flammable, so what's going on here? The later commentaries actually talk about this, and they say, and they give all sorts of reasons. Some people think it's sorcery. It was like a sorcery thing, and they didn't want people using flammable items to wipe themselves because people would use sorcery with it, and sorcery doesn't really exist anymore, so we're not worried about people doing that. Some people say it's that they were doing it to ward off evil spirits, and it's only people who do their thing outside in nature, and that it's not relevant if you're not out in nature. Other people say this was some process that happened and we're just desensitized to it at this point because we clearly know that this isn't such an issue and therefore we don't need to follow this anymore. So anyway, all different thoughts about how the commentaries grapple with some source they see which doesn't seem to match their reality, not with the fact that people are using these things and with the fact that they can't see any real reason as to why this is. So they try to put it into, maybe it's evil spirits, right? Maybe it's sorcery, maybe it's things we don't understand, have to do with the time, period after time. Okay. So anyway, the point being, you could have said, don't use the stalk of the reed because it's flammable, not because it splinters off. To which they answer, Amarav Papa, kinuach pimaka kamrina. No, you misunderstood. What they were talking about, the stalk of the reed, was not the issue. Fine, flammable things you shouldn't wipe with. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about actually cleaning out a wound, using this to clean out a wound where the splinter will get under your skin and cause an infection. And that's the issue here, and it's not talking at all about wiping after going to the bathroom. Okay. Kol shochatin. So that's the end of that braita. Basically, we spent the entire class really on that one braita that we brought to make this distinction between shlasho ulevasoch chibro, right, detached and then became attached, and to show that distinction, we resolved this inner contradiction in the braita by explaining one is that, one is, right, mechubar from the beginning, even though ultimately in Rava, right, in those attempts to come up with an answer to the question that Rava asked about shchita, we end up saying maybe that's not what it means. And maybe it's actually talking about explaining the next line about the knife, and only in a knife case would shchita be good, but not actually if it was just detached and subsequently attached. Okay, so that ends that section. Within that, just I may as well summarize right now before we start the end of our daf, we talked about the different parts of the Mishnah, the muchni, and we brought a contradiction there and resolved it, direct, indirect. We saw the source that Rebbi brought to show that you have to slaughter things with something detached from the ground, from the akeda. Rebbi completely dismissed his proof. We saw that Rava talked about this, when it came to avodah zarah, when it came to susceptibility, impurity, and then tried to come up with what the answer is for our case in shchita, but wasn't successful. And then we had the knife, and we said, oh, that's right. Does it have to be when the animal's below? Right? We did, and not above because of gravity. And then we brought another source that seemed to contradict that, but explained the other source in two possible ways to resolve that contradiction. And then finished up with these 5 things we say about the krumit shel kaneh. We seem to be worried about splintering. Why aren't we worried about that when it comes to the shchita in the source that we saw previously? And that's because we're talking about different kinds of reeds. One is soft, one is hard. Hard ones we're worried about splintering. Soft ones we can actually use for slaughtering. Then, right, obviously you'd have to sharpen the edge of it, but it's not like we're worried it's going to splinter off. Then we're going to end with, back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said, hakol shochatin, everything gets slaughtered, ula olam shochatin, and you can always slaughter, okay, forever, it sounds like. So what do we mean by this? Hakol shochatin, hakol b'shchita v'afilu of, everything needs slaughtering, even birds. Okay, that was easy. The next line is not going to be so easy, and we're going to leave it with an open question today and resolve it tomorrow. Lo olam shochatin man tana. Which tana does this go according to, that you can always slaughter? I'm a Rava. Rava explains, Rabbi Yishmael, this is Rabbi Yishmael's position. Tanya ki archiv Hashem Elokecha et gvulcha, hasher diber lach, v'amarto ochla basal. When God expands your boundaries, meaning when you get into the land, and you want to eat meat, presumably what we mean is, well, you don't, when you were in the desert, you weren't so far from the Mishkan. You could always bring a sacrifice. But now you want to just eat meat, and you can't always go to the temple. It's far. So Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Lo ba katuv ela latir lahem basar ta'ava. The pasuk is coming to say, if you want to eat meat, you're allowed to. Shebitchila ne'asar lahem basar ta'ava. In the desert, they weren't allowed to just eat meat whenever they wanted, because they had to bring it as a sacrifice if they wanted to have meat. Mishe nechnesu la'aretz, once they got into the land, hutar lahem basar ta'ava. God permitted it. Now, lekach shaninu la'olam shochatim. On that basis comes Rabbi, and he says, that's why it says you can forever do shchita. Why? Because you might have thought, did I read? Achshav shegalu, I skipped a line. La'achar shegalu, yachol yachzeru li'isuran harishon. You might have thought now that we're in exile, we're no longer in the land. Maybe we go back to the original prohibition that you can't eat meat whenever you want. Lekach shaninu la'olam shochatim. That's why it's telling you, no. You can always slaughter. Once it was permitted forever. But Matkifla Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef doesn't like Rabba's interpretation for a few reasons. First of all, lo olam shochatin v'ochlim mebayale. If the whole point is, you can, it means really you can always slaughter if you want to eat meat, then it should have said, lo olam shochatin v'ochlim. If the whole idea is you have a heter to eat meat whenever you want, forever, we don't go back to this original prohibition, well then it should have said, you can always slaughter to eat, right? And eat. It doesn't say that. Ve'od, and furthermore, and here's where we'll end, mi'ikara my time ha'itzer. Let's think about the logic here. Why was it forbidden originally? Mishum dahavu makavi l'mishkan, because they were right near the Mishkan. Ulevaself my time ha'ishtaru, and why was it permitted ultimately? Dahavu merach came in Mishkan, because as I said before, they were far from the Mishkan, living in all different places in the north of Israel and the south of Israel. It's possible to go travel all the time, every time you want to eat meat. V'koshken, we'll just finish one more line on the next page. V'koshken hashta de'urchakulu t'fei. All the more so nowadays, when we don't, right, we're much farther, and forget about the fact that, there's no temple to bring sacrifices in, but even if, let's say, you could, you would have to go there. We're not going back there. I mean, that's really far for people once they're exiled. So the logic to think that it might have been forbidden, go back to the original prohibition, makes no sense. So we're going to wait and see what Rabbi Yosef then suggests as what this phrase, la'olam shochatin, means. So what we explained here was what hakol shochatin, even birds need shchita, but la'olam shochatin, we're still trying to figure out what it means. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.